Welcome, everyone, to DEI After 5, the show that focuses on topics across diversity, equity, and inclusion with some of the brightest minds in the industry. Here's your hostess, inclusive culture curator and coach, Sacha Thompson.
Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of DEI After 5. So, if you have been paying attention to anything that's going on, you will notice that there's just been lots of conversation around DEI. It has become very politicized, and in some places, organizations are getting rid of their chief diversity officers. They're getting rid of their DEI committees and teams. They are just really dismantling a lot of the work that had been done over the last few years. And so one of the things that I really want to talk about is, if DEI is gone, how do you continue doing the work? And so today I am talking to another consultant in this space, Juan Tavares, who is an HR consultant, but we're going to talk about all the things because it's all interconnected. So Juan, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Sasha. Great to be here.
So Juan, for anyone that may not know who you are, can you tell us a little bit about you and how you got into this work?
Yes, absolutely. So Juan Tavares, HR and DEI consultant. I've been in the HR space for 13 years now, mostly in the nonprofit sector. But a year ago, went off on my own and started my own consulting firm. And my wife, she's my co-partner or co-founder, and really to address a need that we saw in the DEI landscape, we created DEI ProFinder, which is a public online directory for DEI consultants. Because one of the challenges that I had as an HR leader when I had the responsibility of creating DEI strategy in the organizations where I worked is where to go, like how to get information. And obviously, I used my network, leveraged my networking on LinkedIn, but I was surprised that there wasn't any place where you can go to find out more about consultants. And one thing that I knew sort of intuitively is that there is a broad landscape out there about DEI. There's so many different ways to do this work, and the consultants bring a different lived experience to this work. And there's what I like to do with DEI ProFinder is help leaders find the right fit consultant for their work, because it really depends on what's going on in the organization. So long story short, we created DEI ProFinder, and for the last year, we've been not only growing the directory, but also working with organizations on supporting their DEI strategies. And sadly, to your point, a lot of organizations are either pausing or completely stopping this work. So I'm excited we're having this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it is a sad thing, right? Where so many companies made these bold statements 3+ years ago on their support for DEI and this investment in this space. And some even doubled down in the space. And then recent research is showing that many of those organizations have either not meet the goals that they set for themselves in this space. They're, dismantling their DEI offices or teams. Some even going as far as saying, well, what we put in place isn't working, but not questioning the fact that they gave it no resources or support. So that's a whole other conversation. And then the other thing that I started noticing a lot of was they were giving a lot of this heavy lifting to volunteer employees, whereas they don't necessarily have the background experience, bandwidth, resources, all of those things in order to stand up strategy, for example, DEI strategy within an organization. So again, they're being set up to fail. So talk to me a little bit about, as you're seeing these organizations kind of pull back, and I'm not going to say totally dismantle, because some of them have some iteration that they're keeping. As they're starting to pull back, where are you seeing some of these responsibilities fall?
Yeah, great question. So, and I'm glad you mentioned that it isn't across the workforce, right?
Yeah.
There's a spectrum. You definitely have the companies that are completely pulling out of this work because they're saying either it didn't work, or in some cases it caused more harm. But to your point, are not really taking the time to unpack that or the reasons why that happened. And then you've got folks that I to this day I still get calls from folks that are just getting started and
Yeah.
to learn more, but there's that middle space where folks are, and this is where I get excited to work with organizations that are pausing the work intentionally and taking time to reassess, right? Because one thing that I've noticed that happened over the last 3 years is because of the societal unrest from 2020, organizations jumped into there was like an urgency, right, to this work. So many organizations jumped into the deep end on DEI, and this work is so personal and intimate and requires us as individuals and humans in the workspace to get vulnerable and talk about things that we're not used to talking about at work. So if looking back now, and this is even for me in hindsight, I recognize that there needs to be a foundational piece in place before we can dive into that. And that's what I see a lot of clients starting to do now. It's like, okay, we move too quickly. So let's take a step back. What can we do now to ensure that these conversations are more fruitful, that our staff members continue to feel safe and engaged in the work, so that we can see the results long term.
Yeah. Something that I've also realized or noticed that is happening too, and you spoke to it, was a lot of the work that we saw in 2020 was reactionary.
Correct.
Right. It was something's happened. Okay, let's react. And part of the pause that I'm noticing, and I wish I would see more of, is, okay, how do we become more proactive in this space? Because 2020, there was a spring and summer and fall of social unrest.
Yeah.
Social unrest is inevitable in the world that we live in. And so how do you start to be more intentional with your inclusion efforts or your DEI efforts in light of the world around us constantly changing? And so part of what I'm hearing, or I'm hopeful in seeing more of, is how do we become more intentional with our strategies? How do we make sure that what we are saying aligns with what people are experiencing in the workplace? Because that was a big thing in 2020, right? Organizations coming out, Black Lives Matter, and the employees were like, really?
That's news to me. Yeah.
Right. I don't feel it. I'm not feeling the love. And so I'm really curious to hear from you on these organizations that are pausing. What are they considering right now? Like, what are some of the things that are top of mind for them?
Great question. So a few things that I'm engaged with clients at the moment is being, and you touched on this earlier, being realistic about outcomes and goals. Something that I noticed in 2020 was these big, audacious, we're going to have change in the next 12 months or a year, or 1 to 2 years. And then they didn't back that up with resources. They didn't walk the talk. So what I'm seeing now is, and again, this is not, I'm an operation of one, right? So I have a very limited client base, but some of my clients are focused on being realistic about what they can achieve by when. And what I get excited about when I think about strategy development is, let's not think about 6 months, or a year or even 2 years from now. What can we do in the next 6 months? What are the issues that your staff members are experiencing today that we can start to address immediately? We don't need to have this big plan that oftentimes is where leaders get caught, right? It's like, oh, well, we need to have everything planned out and laid out, and what's one step out. And I push back on that. I say there is a time and a place for that kind of strategy, but right now it's about addressing the needs of your employees today. Like, what can we do in the next week or month or quarter. So really focusing on getting those small wins, because then that's where you start to build momentum, right?
Yeah.
You
That's
start
the
to
low-hanging
see.
fruit.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that we talked about, as we were prepping for this, was as organizations are kind of stepping back a bit, or realizing, okay, I don't know if we want an office dedicated to diversity, equity, and inclusion, or we have this committee that's doing stuff, so they're already employees. We don't have to hire a full-time person to do this, but we know the work needs to be done.
Mm-hmm.
And so what you and I, talked about was that oftentimes falls on, I said oftentimes a lot, but that falls on HR. It falls on human resources. I know from my experience that there are many folks within human resources that are not equipped to do this work either.
Yeah.
So what can organizations do to either support HR in these roles? Because this is just one piece of what HR does if they are being tasked with it. Or how else can they support the work if that's a decision that they're making?
Yeah. And that resonates with me, that question, because I was in those shoes, right? As an HR leader in a small nonprofit, we didn't have the capacity to add on a DEI role. So it landed on me and my team. And to your point, we're like, HR there's a lot of connections and overlap there between the DEI work and HR work, but it's a completely different world, which is why I quickly knew I needed to rely on consultants for support. So started to reach out to folks to help me figure out what I didn't know, right? And get on the right path. So to answer your question though, that requires resources. So as an HR leader, advocating for what you need, excuse me, I saw the importance of this work. So I said, yes, absolutely, I will take it on. And I need your support, right? Senior leadership with money in a volunteer committee. So that was another thing we did. To your point, we have a number of, and this is not, many organizations do this, have a group of volunteer staff members that are passionate about DEI and can lead some of that work. But one of the things that I was very intentional about was not putting all of that responsibility on that committee, because again, they have full-time jobs. This is a volunteer role. So it was really leveraging them as the eyes and ears of the organization, right? So they would feed me with, here's what's happening, here's what people are saying and feeling, so that then I can inform the strategy in that way. But it was so they served as the voice, right, of the rest of the organization. But it was critical to have that, because it also doesn't, from my perspective, it also doesn't work when it's just top down, right? When it's an HR leader making all the calls and all the decisions.
Right.
So you need to find that balance and work with what you've got. And I love what you said earlier. Focus on the low-hanging fruit. I think we try to bite off more than we can chew most of the time. And it's like, let's just see what we can do with what we've got and start there. I think people appreciate that more than lip service and then big promises that go nowhere.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I have seen organizations where they have this committee, this employee committee, without the support. And that's why I'm just like, that you're setting them up to fail. Because if you're not giving them the support, the resources, the guidance, any of those things, then what are you truly trying to accomplish? Other than to say, oh, we did it and it didn't work, right? But I've also worked with a couple of organizations, and one in particular, we were very intentional in how we put that committee together. And it was people that were people leaders, people that were independent contributors, people that were more junior, people that were more senior. I had someone that was the naysayer, right? Like the one this is never going to work, right? Because you wanted those voices at the table. And what I loved about working with that organization was this group would get together, and I was sneaking in the vegetables of leadership development, but it was really Okay, so what are you trying to accomplish? How are you going to do that? How are you going to communicate this out to the rest of the organization?
Mm-hmm.
And they would come up with a plan and strategy of, okay, well, how are we going to push this out there? So what are some of the pushback? What are some of the questions that you're going to get? And they could, especially my naysayer, right? Oh, they're going to want to know this. Okay, well, how do you prepare for that?
Yes.
Right. And so it was part of, it really was some leadership development that they came out of it. So it wasn't just this volunteer group. It was, I'm building skills and capacities
Mm-hmm.
and capabilities, right? In doing this, that could then be put on part of, now that they're looking for promotion, now they're looking for something else they can add, and there's some meat and some meaningfulness to it. So I think that that's one of the workarounds, because many of these groups, it is a lot of work that they're being asked to do or being tasked with for free.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of, one of the ways that you could do it. The other thing that I realized, or I'm starting to notice more of, is, yes, some of this falls on HR, but I'm starting to see, and a lot of our listeners are leaders within their organizations that are, excuse me, saying, I want to show up as a more inclusive leader.
Mm.
And so how can I take some of this on? And so talk to me a little bit about, because I know you do some work with teams and leadership as well. So talk to me about how some leaders can take on some of this responsibility if their organizations have made decisions to not formally go forward with this.
Yeah, great question. So I'll talk a little bit about a project my wife and I have kicked off earlier this year around the idea of creating psychological safety on teams, and leaders having the biggest influence in making that happen. So if there are leaders out there that are wanting to know how to create more inclusive and welcoming and engaging workspaces, it does require, from our perspective, a lot of self-work initially, right?
Mm-hmm.
In order to show up authentically and confidently into that space as a leader, you really have to know who you are and what your values are and what your strengths are and what your purpose is, because that work inevitably will challenge you, right? Inclusion, and the way that we talk about inclusion is it's living in the gray, right? So I have a perspective, someone else has a perspective. It's not about being right or wrong. It's about taking the time to respect, value, and understand the difference, right? Yeah. So you're going to get challenged. You're going to get it's going to get there, right? And I'm flooded with memories of times where I've been in those spaces, and it's like, okay, this is, as a leader, like, I'm not here to place blame, pass judgment, or impose my own personal views or opinions on any individual. So how do we create an environment where we can coexist and value each other and respect each other? So a lot of the tenets, right, that are necessary to create psychological safety around inclusivity and engagement, start in emotional intelligence and vulnerability, start with knowing yourself really well.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll start there. I think leaders that alone can be, a year's worth of work.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's funny because, this is the space that I live in, right, around psychological safety. Yeah. And one of the ways that I have found to be very helpful is, so we do these psychological safety assessments, and each leader gets their team's responses. Like, they get their own score. And when I tell you that it's eye-opening for many of them, because they're like, oh, I'm just, I'm doing great. And then they see this is where you fall when it comes to each of the 4 stages of psychological safety.
Oh, I love that.
It starts that conversation around, how am I showing up as a leader?
Mm-hmm.
What I've also found is, for many people, they're not taught how to be a leader. Yeah. They mimic what they've seen before, which may not have been the most inclusive or progressive way of thinking about leadership. And so to your point, it's not just the values, but it's like, how do you want to be as a leader?
Mm-hmm.
What type of leader do you want to be? And then let's start closing that gap. And so again, the coaching that we do is like, okay, here's a starting point. This is where you want to be. Let's help you close this gap so that you can show up not only as a more authentic and inclusive leader, but you're creating the psychological safety for your team and within your organization.
That's awesome.
And you touched on something that I'm just like, yes, that's yes, was the emotional intelligence piece.
Absolutely.
When I first started this show, the very first episode that I did was with Farah Harris on emotional intelligence, because it is such a critical part of doing DEI work, but it's also, as you said, foundational to creating psychological safety within organizations and for leadership. And part of that emotional intelligence is that self-awareness.
Mm-hmm.
And can I tell you, I have sat in meetings, I have been part of situations where I'm sitting back and I'm like, there is some low EQ in this room.
Yeah.
And leaders are just espousing and just saying whatever they want to say, not reading the room, not understanding how it may be landing, and so I'm very curious with the work that you all are doing, how open have leaders been in doing some of that internalized work that needs to take place?
Yeah, good question. I think that's some of the hardest work. So it's where we get the most pushback. And when I say pushback, I mean there's a desire to sort of breeze over it or through it. We have a number of exercises to figure out what your values are and what your strengths are that we go through. And we also spend some time addressing what we call vulnerability blocks. So it's when you hear terms like diversity, equity, and inclusion, like what emotions does that spur? And then we tap into that fear, because it's often fear based.
Yeah.
And then unpack that. So that takes time, and that also requires a lot of introspection that I would say most people, it's just human nature. I think is we are averse to doing that work. And to your point, how leaders are, this is not something that they're taught, right? They're taught to manage people, so putting on their manager hat, and it's about project management and deadlines and deliverables and accountability, which is important, of course, but that has to be balanced, especially in today's workplace, with empathy and the ability to take someone's perspective and support them through challenges as their leader. So yeah, and one of the things I'd like to say that opens, usually sort of creates a light bulb moment for folks, is you can't do for others what you haven't done for yourself.
Ooh, say it again.
You can't do for others what you haven't done for yourself.
Yes.
Right? So as a leader, imagine how hard it is to show support or empathy, right, for an individual when you haven't been the receiver of any of that kind of treatment before.
Yeah.
So that we need to get past that block and start changing, right, the future, the trajectory of future leaders, because we want more and more people to have those experiences.
That was just so powerful, because it's those aha moments, right? And I remember years ago doing a facilitation, and this one gentleman was very anti-DEI, right? There was nothing that you could say or do, like he would just not get it. He just didn't understand the importance of it. And we showed a video, and when we came back to the screen, I could tell his demeanor had changed. And so I was just like, okay, so what's going on? And he was like, my wife is in a wheelchair. And we went to Disney, and you wouldn't imagine the things that we had to navigate in order to have an experience for her. And because, so it was very personal for him, and understanding the needs that his wife had, right? And navigating, going to Disney.
Yeah.
And Disney's a place that is, that thinks about that and is fairly accessible. But it said it took him kind of thinking about it from that perspective to understand the importance of inclusion.
Yes.
And so, it was that aha moment of, okay, now that I kind of get it from that perspective, what does this mean for other people?
Yes.
And to see and witness that shift happen so quickly was one of those moments where I was just like, oh, this is why I do what I do.
Yeah.
Right? Because you want to see those light bulbs and aha moments.
Yeah.
But it is that introspection that is so critical in doing any of this work. And, as organizations are making decisions to shift the responsibility of this work or who's going to be leading it or however the structure is, anybody that's going to be touching it, needs to do that introspective work.
100%.
Because passion is great, but passion could also cause problems.
Absolutely. Yes.
If you haven't done that work on yourself. So Juan, we're going to do a little bit of a pivot.
Okay.
Because this work is difficult. What are the things that you do to kind of take care of yourself, to fill your cup as you are doing this?
Yeah, good question. It's so self-care. It's so important. And I don't know if I mentioned this earlier. My wife is a clinical psychologist, so she is not only my co-founder and partner, but my therapist at home.
Yeah, therapist, right?
So I have a huge benefit there, that she supports me in many ways. But I would say what the things that I do to fill my cup, family is really important to me. We have 3 daughters. So spending time with them is very, very valuable and fills me up very much. And one of the reasons I left the workforce and started my own consulting firm was to have more time to spend with my family. I felt, was starting to get a little, I don't want to say complete burnout, but crispy on the edges, if you will.
Yeah. I love that.
doing this work. So I said, you know what, I need more time with family, and to think about work in a different way. So now I get to do the work that I love, but also have the balance to spend time with my family. And then the other thing that I would say is expressing my creativity is also helps with just changing completely, going from like this conversation that we're having now, and I can do this all day, but then complete pivot to, doodling with my daughters, or doing arts and crafts, or it could even be reading a book, whatever it is that completely shifts your thinking or the way that your brain is working. I think to give the other parts of your brain that pause and that time to rest.
Yeah. I had another guest on recently where talked about doing the things that bring you joy and, and filling your cup, because it then also helps you show up better at work.
Absolutely.
Right. So though it is slightly a pivot, right, doing those doodles and reading those, filling your cup in those ways absolutely help you show up as a better, consultant and practitioner in this space. So continue doodling and all the things. I love it. Yeah. So Juan, if people wanted to connect with you, what is the best way for them to do that?
All right. So LinkedIn is sort of my business home base. So there it is, my LinkedIn profile. So connect with me, follow me. I post pretty regularly about DEI, HR, and psychological safety. And then if you want to visit our website, it's DEIProfinder.com. And that's where you can get connected to DEI consultants doing this work. And if you need help finding what it is that you need, or if you're just getting started or doing an assessment, then I'm happy to help. I can make those connections for you as well.
Wonderful. Juan, thank you so much for joining us and being a part of this conversation, this ongoing conversation, because I think that many organizations are trying to figure out kind of their next steps. And this is a great way for them to look at some other options and how they can do that. Absolutely. So thank you so much for being with us this week. And thank you all for joining this episode of DEI After 5. I hope you were able to walk away with a nugget or two that you can start using or utilizing within your organizations starting today. As always, you can find us here every Tuesday at 5:15 p.m. Eastern on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform. Be sure to like, share, subscribe, all the things. And until next time, have a good one.